The past few months, there's been a lot of discussion around Final Fantasy game sales. This all came after two mainline entries, Final Fantasy XVI and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, have reportedly failed to meet their sales expectations. Since then, there's been a lot of community discussion about where Final Fantasy goes from here, and there is one of these points of discussions that I think is worthy of diving into, and that is, should Final Fantasy downscale to become a AA game? In theory, this is a viable solution, because if you can't sell more units, the other thing you can do is cut cost and make a cheaper product. 3 million in sales may not be enough for a big AAA project, but for games that cost less money, even 1 million in sales can be a huge deal. So the question here is, should Final Fantasy scale down to be the size of, let's just arbitrarily say, Metaphor ReFantazio? A massive game for sure, and some of Atlus's top-tier production quality, and despite 8 years of development, it almost certainly didn't require the amount of financial resources or manpower that something like, let's say, FF16 required. As someone who has made literally hundreds of videos on this series now, this is a question that I spent a ton of time thinking about. My answer here is going to surprise you guys, because I'm sure a lot of you probably think that I'm going to sit here and say that they should scale down to AA. And I do believe we need more AA games and need to support more AA games for sure. However, my ultimate conclusion is that Final Fantasy should not back down from AAA, and in fact, it can't back down from AAA. And today I want to talk about exactly why it is that I believe that. But first, how would you like to get Monster Hunter Wilds for only $57? And thanks to our sponsor Instant Gaming, you can save a ton of money on Steam codes for games. For example, you can get Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 for only $48. And every month, Instant Gaming allows us to give away a free game. All you have to do is hit participate and you're entered to win. So check out Instant Gaming with a link in the description below and in the pinned comment. The popularity of Final Fantasy in the West really and truly saw its boom with the release of Final Fantasy VII. It is still the highest selling Final Fantasy game of all time, and is widely considered to be one of the first, if not the first, AAA blockbuster video game. When the game debuted in 1997, it cost $45 million to develop. In 2025, this is the equivalent of $89.5 million, almost 90 million. To be clear, this is just the development cost. This is not also including the marketing costs, which just about doubles this number. This is equivalent to the development cost of many PlayStation 4 titles, and they were spending that on a PS1 game, something absolutely unheard of at the time, and something that completely blew the competition away, but ultimately created a path that most of the industry would see themselves following down. And listen, it's fine when you're spending that much and you're selling over 14 million units, but when you aren't, it becomes a lot less sustainable. A lot of people think that this issue is new or something that is recently developing, but if you go listen to Hajime Tabata at GDC 2017, he explains that when he took over Final Fantasy XV's development, Square was absolutely demoralized about the brand. Tabata learned that the sales forecasts for the game were quite low, sitting at under 5 million units worldwide. And what you may find even more shocking is that they deemed the move away from turn-based to be unwise.
So I was told by everyone that switching away from normal turn-based combat was unwise, and that the Final Fantasy brand had diminished and was in danger.
I am very sure that a lot of you are going to have things to say about that in the comments below, but ultimately, according to Tabata, Square Enix had considered the Final Fantasy brand to be diminished and in danger. And all of this was happening way before the Final Fantasy XVI or Rebirth stuff. So while it may be surprising news for some people now, it's really been brewing for quite a while. Of course, Tabata, hearing that they had set the sales expectations so low, wanted to challenge them. So he moved the sales target from below 5 million to 6 million units worldwide. And not only did he achieve it, they absolutely knocked it out of the park. they sold that 6 million units in the first month of release, with the game currently sitting at over 10 million units sold. With all of this in mind, I'm sure some of you think this is all the more reason to back out of AAA, and that is a fair enough assessment. However, when I really think on it, and I really think about Final Fantasy and its history and the spirit of it, and in particular when FF was at the height of its popularity, the impressive budgets and technology that they were able to use is not unrelated to those things, and in many ways is necessary to create the core experience of the series that so many people look for. Final Fantasy VII solidified being a big AAA JRPG as part of the core identity of the series. It's what made the series stand out amongst the competition, and if it were to scale down, it'd lose a lot of what helped it stand out in the first place. There's already a lot of AA JRPGs, but not only that, think about what brought you into Final Fantasy. Maybe some of you got in during the NES or SNES era, but I'm willing to bet the vast majority of you got into the series during the PlayStation era. Could you imagine Final Fantasy X without the epic cutscenes with full voice acting? Would that game have stood out and had the same impact we've come to associate with Final Fantasy? The odds are, it probably wouldn't. I don't think you would have been as absorbed into Final Fantasy VIII if you didn't see that jaw-dropping opening cinematic either. And going back to the origins of this with Final Fantasy VII, the explosion of the series that caused the explosion of JRPGs as a whole was very much predicated on its AAA visuals at the time, with 3 full CD-ROMs of some of the most impressive cinematics that people had ever seen. And with over 100 pre-rendered backgrounds in these games, there is no way the adventure would be to the scale that it is without the budgets required to produce them. Also, bluntly put, I just don't think that Square Enix is prepared to make a AA Final Fantasy, and it shows. For starters, most of Square Enix's AA games over the past few years have not been particularly high sellers, nor have they been critically acclaimed. The outliers to this have been the Team Asano games such as Octopath Traveler and Bravely Default, and if they were to make a AA Final Fantasy, there is no better team to do it. Problem is that we also have 2 dedicated mainline Final Fantasy teams, that being Creative Studio 1 and Creative Studio 3. These are the primary producers for Final Fantasy, and Team Asano is already making their own IP. It doesn't really make sense to me to pull them off of that to make more Final Fantasy. But suppose that Final Fantasy was to scale its budget down to something like Persona. So typically, a Japanese AAA game will have something like 300 to 500 core developers, and Persona 5 had around 75 developers at the height of its development. The cost difference is huge, and there's no way that Persona 5 costed anywhere near the amount of something like, say, Final Fantasy 16, especially when much of P5 lacks voice acting and fully animated cutscenes, often using more diorama-like scenes without a ton of motion-captured animations. But if Square Enix were to scale FF down to this level, then they would be competing with a ton of AA JRPGs that are already in their stride and dominate at what they do. Games like Persona or Like a Dragon already fundamentally understand what they need to do for the level that they're at. RGG, for example, is already a master at reusing assets and developing games within a timely manner. I want to be clear here, it is definitely possible for them to do this, but they would need to be extraordinarily clever about how they approach it. But also, I think that scaling down Final Fantasy is tantamount to scaling down Square Enix as a whole. At the very least, globally, there is nothing that Square Enix is known for more than Final Fantasy. It is their highest selling series by far and the one they've made the most money on. While they do own some really popular IPs such as Dragon Quest, Kingdom Hearts, and Nier, I think Final Fantasy possesses a unique quality to reinvent itself in a different time, setting, change art styles, tone, and entirely reboot whenever it needs to. And it's these core things that allow FF to sell in the way that it does, allowing it to always be the face of Square Enix. Thus, as a result, I can only see scaling down Final Fantasy to be tantamount to scaling down Square Enix as a whole. As a publicly traded company, Square Enix must prioritize generating value for its shareholders. To do so, it needs a reliable flagship franchise, preferably one that they can release often that that does consistently well, similar to how Resident Evil does for Capcom or Assassin's Creed does for Ubisoft. Historically, Final Fantasy fulfilled this role, and it has the greatest potential to fill the role again. But it's undeniable that it's currently battling against brand erosion and struggling to maintain its position in the industry. It also seems that the perspective of Square Enix is that it is AAA. It is part of the brand identity. Former director of business at Square Enix, Jacob Novick, made a very long Twitter thread about this. FF12 and FF15 both had a change of director, Matsuno Tabata, during development. FF15 famously took a decade to make and started off as an FF13 spinoff. You cannot dictate, devs be more efficient. You have to know which creatives to give control, when to cut your losses, and when to have cash reserves to pivot. And as technology changes, games tend to change. There are huge technology strides in just 2 to 3 years in our industry. Forget 5 years. The 90s FF7 had as many myriad of things to do as FF16, and also pushed the edge of computer graphics, taking up nearly all the CGI capacity of Japan at the time, a story its developers love to repeat to me over drinks. FF7 was done faster because the technology was simpler, and the bleeding edge of graphics at a far lower fidelity. Engineers have not gotten less skilled, and artists have not gotten worse at their craft in the ensuing decades. Everyone has gotten better. It is the bar that is set higher because of what it takes to achieve fidelity. To that end, you cannot make a 20-hour AA Final Fantasy and have it still be Final Fantasy. You can make an amazing 100-hour AA game like Octopath Traveler, or you can make an incredible 20-hour AAA game like Alan Wake 2, which, by the way, did not recoup its dev cost on launch. But the FF brand is supposed to be a spectacular 100+ hour AAA journey. That is what the brand means. Anything less will get a terrible reaction from consumers. So if you want to make cheaper, shorter, lower quality products, you need to use a different brand. I know it's easy for many people to think that this is preposterous right away. However, again, really thinking back on it, would Final Fantasy X be the same if it was a AA PS2 game versus the game that Final Fantasy X actually ended up being? The same goes for 7, 8, and 9. Those big flashy moments, those incredible pre-rendered backgrounds, dozens of massive towns that you can explore, the mini games, all that was possible because of the massive AAA budget. And without it, those games wouldn't be what they are now. I also can't help but think, looking at Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, what those games could look like in the modern era. Rebirth doesn't just lay out what Final Fantasy VII would look like on modern systems. It actually provides a template for what the classic FF 1 through 9 formula could look like if it were adapted to the HD era. And honestly, as a longtime Final Fantasy fan, that is exactly what I want to see manifest for Final Fantasy 17. Yes, there is personal bias, of course there is. But I mean, after all, to be a fan of something, you have to have a personal bias. And I do want to see more games in that style. This all being said, while I do hope and want Final Fantasy to stay AAA, a lot of things about it need to change. And one of the mistakes that they keep making, I just don't understand, is that typically, after every Final Fantasy game releases, Square Enix either disbands the team or puts them on another new project. The engine that they were using typically gets discarded in favor of a new piece of technology, or that team carries the tech over into a new IP, such as the case with Final Fantasy XV's team and Forspoken. Think about how insane this is. For the most part, no one is working on 2 mainline Final Fantasy games in a row. The only sort of exception is Yoshi P with Final Fantasy XIV and XVI as the producer of both, and Hiroshi Takai, who co-directed Heavensward as well as 16. Even still, it's a little bit difficult to actually count this, as one is an MMO and the other one is an offline single-player game. And so there really isn't the type of carryover that you would see from Kitase working on Final Fantasy VI and then going to work on Final Fantasy VII and 8. How is it possible for the team, for the directors, to get better at making Final Fantasy games when the moment that they do make a Final Fantasy game, they're going to be moved off of the project and make something else with an entirely different team? I know this sounds absurd, but this is really what Square Enix has been doing for the past 2 decades, and it's a large problem for why the quality and consistency of their games is nowhere near what it used to be. Cycling and rearranging teams is an inevitable part of managing a company this large, but keeping teams together has been shown to improve efficiency efficiency in game development, and this was cited as one of the biggest reasons that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth only took an incredibly short 3 years of active development time to make one of the most massive AAA games of the generation, and quite frankly, of all time. When a Bloomberg article asked how they accomplished this, they said, quote, "The secret," Hamaguchi said, "was a trait that many video game studios don't seem to prioritize: team chemistry. Between 80% and 90% of the Final Fantasy VII Remake development team stuck around to make Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, which allowed for more efficient development, even during the height of the pandemic. It was quite clear who to go to if we had a certain question or problem we were trying to solve," Hamaguchi said. "We were able to work together as a team and achieve this great flow and tempo of game development." However, you may still be concerned that they will break the team up again after the release of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, but thankfully this doesn't seem to be the case, at least according to Hamaguchi, as he says he wants to keep the Re-Trilogy development team together even after Part 3, meaning that it's very possible this is the team that is going to be working on Final Fantasy 17 or 18. But I guarantee you that if they're using Unreal, if they're using the tools that they've already built for Final Fantasy VII Re-Trilogy, if they're building off everything they learned and are trying to make a better Final Fantasy game faster, cheaper, they'll probably be able to succeed at it, just as they were able to succeed at doing that exact thing going from Remake to Rebirth. Obviously, multi-platform development is one thing that will greatly help sales. It's hard to say how much of a paradigm shift it will be, but I definitely think by being on PC day one, they can sell an extra million or 2 copies. The overwhelming majority of fans have asked for Final Fantasy VII Remake style of combat to be reused, a huge time and money saver instead of having to reinvent a brand new style of combat each time, only for it to receive far less reception and be mixed among the fans. This doesn't mean that combat can't be innovative, it should, but Final Fantasy has always had innovative combat even when it was sticking to a fundamental system like ATB. It was always changing things up and doing new things, and it can still do that within the framework set out by Re-Trilogy in the same fashion that it used to, and a routine release schedule that allows people to grow up with Final Fantasy again, looking forward to each game, with 2 teams alternating on active releases for the game, allowing new mainline titles to come every 2 to 3 years. Final Fantasy was built on innovation, scale, and spectacle, qualities that have defined it as the industry's premier AAA JRPG. Scaling it down would strip away what makes it so unique, forcing it to compete in a crowd of mid-budget titles where other franchises like Persona and Like a Dragon already dominate. More importantly, it's Square Enix's flagship IP, and Final Fantasy carries the legacy of the company and its financial future. Rather than retreating from AAA, Square Enix should just do AAA right, refine its approach. We shouldn't be trying to minimize Final Fantasy, but ensure that not only that Final Fantasy survives but thrives as a top-tier blockbuster franchise. But these are just my thoughts. Let me know how much you disagree in the comments below. Be sure to check out Instant Gaming, and I'll see you all in the next video. Later, guys.